This is Andy Revkin, a pop-up sustain what conversation with Mike Smith, a meteorologist who for decades has been focused on weather forecasting, on policy related to it. He's worked across the spectrum within the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and at AccuWeather.
At AccuWeather, and before that, Weather Data Incorporated, which was the company I founded in 1981. I sold it to AccuWeather in 2006, and our whole focus was extreme weather.
Right.
We didn't do any long range forecasts, 30-day forecasts. We did none of that. Our entire focus was high impact extreme weather.
Right. And we have been in touch for years now on
Yes.
your efforts to improve not just the forecasting, but the warning, turning the forecast into effective warning, meaning getting people to act, people and organizations to respond. And there's been some significant issues you have described with tornado warnings, hurricane forecasting. And here we're going to talk about Helene, which, was well forecast at the basic level from the early days. But you'd say that the way this played out with regional information, you saw some deep flaws right at the very beginning. And so just talk us through here. I've got up here the September 24th alert from the National Hurricane Center, and I'll scroll down to the relevant lines. But what are you looking for at this point? You're on your computer, you're looking at models.
Right.
It's still in the Caribbean, not quite in the Gulf at that point, or was it in the Gulf?
It was in the Southern Gulf at that point. Right. It was still being called tropical storm or tropical system number 9. It was forecast to be a storm that would undergo rapid intensification. And for that, the National Hurricane Center deserves a great deal of praise. We probably would not have been able to make that sort of intensification forecast a decade ago. They have gotten very good at anticipating it. And they made an excellent forecast as far as the future path and intensification of the hurricane itself.
Right. That was like to Big Bend, that sort of track towards the Big Bend area of Florida was very clear cut.
Yes, they did a very nice job. However, where I fault them is the inland flooding forecast, which I believe was wholly inadequate from this storm. If you look at the information on the 24th, they were saying just isolated minor flooding. And if you look at my isolated flash and urban flooding across the southeast, southern Appalachians, and the Tennessee Valley Wednesday through Friday, minor to isolated moderate river flooding will be possible.
Right.
That doesn't give the signal at all that a catastrophic flood is on the way. And I was go ahead, Andy.
Well, what were you seeing in the models at that point that made you feel so strongly this was really dead wrong?
Well, you had, first of all, what meteorologists call orographic lift of the Appalachian Mountains. Whenever a humid air mass reaches a mountain and is forced to rise, it's going to condense out rain or, in the wintertime, snow. And this was an ideal situation to get incredible amounts of rain in the southern Appalachians. And even at that point, the models weren't truly capturing the magnitude of the event. Sometimes experience plays a role, and perhaps that's the only advantage of being in your 70s, is that you have 50 years of looking at storms like this. And the experience told me that this was going to be a major flood event. And that's why I so emphatically told my audience, who readers of my blog, that this was going to be a major flood situation. And
yeah, I'm just going to highlight that language here. So this is on the 24th, right here.
Right.
And as you said at the time, at this point, the Weather Service says there will be only isolated flash and urban flooding possible across the southeast, southern Appalachians, and Tennessee Valley. I emphatically disagree.
Right.
Below is the rainfall forecast for the next 7 days.
Right. And I talked about what was likely to happen, and at least twice each day in the run-up to landfall of Helene, I not only explained how much rain was going to fall, I was urging proactive evacuations. I was talking about roads being closed due to toppled trees. There is just a lot of information there that I felt the National Weather Service on a national level was not sharing. Now, I do need to emphasize that the local office of the National Weather Service that served northwestern South Carolina and western North Carolina did a pretty good job. They did a nice job. But a lot of people, whether it's truckers, airlines, emergency managers, they want to get a quick update on what's happening across the country. So they look at these national level maps, and they were wholly inadequate for the intensity of storm that ensued.
Yeah, and I assume to some extent weather broadcasters, media presenters, and the like are looking at those national office output to a certain extent as well.
Oh, I'm sure the national ones, like, for example, Good Morning America, are looking at the national level maps. I can't speak for what the local broadcasters were looking at. Hopefully, they were following the guidance from the Spartanburg National Weather Service office. But the fact of the matter is that the national level maps just didn't cut it on this particular storm.
Yeah. And this gets us to this, the calamity is still unfolding. There are some local questions that I have. I just did another conversation with someone who grew up in Asheville. For that county where Asheville, North Carolina is situated, to have 30 deaths just in that county, that's more than all of Georgia, at least at this point. Is so striking because, the topography and the river basin potential is there, but it's not as if the community doesn't know about this. In 2004, they had a dry run for this, a wet run for this event, and in 1916 they had an epic version of the same thing.
Yes, and in 1969 they had flooding from Camille.
Yeah, interesting. So the idea that a hurricane, we always think of historically, I think, as a coastal threat, that it could be a threat in a place like Western North Carolina, it's well understood at the local level, right?
Yes, I would think so. I would hope so anyway.
Yeah. So,
but they still have to rely on meteorologists to give at least a significant insight into what they need to do. And we're getting at the point now on the 25th where the models are indicating more than 20 inches of rain falling very quickly. And at that point, we're calling it catastrophic flooding. And notice it says catastrophic flooding is likely with Hurricane Helene. I mean, that's a pretty strong statement. And, meteorologists don't like to be wrong. But I felt very strongly that up to my face that type of languaging was the only way to get a response that's adequate to the hazard that was presenting itself.
Right. You just cut out there for a brief moment when you were talking about. Could you just repeat that key idea you just had a minute ago, because it got warbly?
Sure. At this point, the models are forecasting more than 20 inches of rain, which, while it does appear there were some areas that got 30 inches, we're now getting into the right order of magnitude. And you can see that forecast on the right. And so I'm trying to give the local people an idea of just the incredible magnitude of what's about to come. And I'm talking about preparing go kits. I'm talking about evacuations. You can see that the forecast is, I think in one place, it's 27 inches. And so we're talking about get your go kit ready. We're talking about roads being blocked by trees. And you'll notice the bottom sentence there says, that is why evacuating sooner rather than later is a good idea.
Right.
And I was afraid that the conditions would become so bad, people couldn't get out once the event started or immediately after.
Right. Yeah, right. And we've seen lots of people stranded still now. So you're stuck kind of, even if you survive the initial onslaught of the waters, that doesn't mean you're in the clear. You have no power,
Right.
no water,
Right.
etc. Now, we had talked for many years also about, again, we're still here in sort of search and recovery and rescue and response and then long recovery. But at the same time, it feels to me appropriate to talk about the bigger questions. And you have, since way over a decade ago, you and others have been pushing for a system at the federal level to look at disasters
Yes.
and assess them the way we do routinely with aviation accidents.
Right.
To have a national disaster review board. There have been several other phrases have come out. There's even proposed
Right.
legislation, bipartisan, I think, legislation that's pushed for this. And tell me how that relates to what we're seeing unfold right now.
The way I see it, there has to be an independent federal agency modeled after the hugely successful National Transportation Safety Board to look at disasters like this, to look at the Maui wildfire, which is far from being resolved at this point. In fact, in a lot of ways, they've been forgotten. As far as I'm concerned, the only way we're going to get this is with an independent federal agency, hopefully located outside the Beltway. Somewhere in the middle of the country would be ideal as far as I'm concerned, that would employ experts like the NTSB does, and they would look at this disaster from top to bottom. They go to the National Hurricane Center, they go to the local National Weather Service offices, they talk to people like AccuWeather and the Weather Channel. They try to look at the entire field as it related, the science of meteorology as it related to forecasting this event. And then they would go talk to emergency managers on the local and state level. What did you do? What prompted you to do it? What messaging caused you to do it? And then they go out and talk to a reasonable cross section of residents of the area. What did you hear? How did you make your decisions? And a number of months later, as with the National Transportation Safety Board, a comprehensive report would be written that would explain how it could have been forecast better, how the messaging could have been improved, how emergency management's function could have worked better, and what we can do to make sure the public gets the right message and the right suggestions as to protect themselves and their property. And given situations like Maui, where literally everything that could have gone wrong that day went wrong. For example, the National Weather Service put out 4 days in advance calling for critical wildfire conditions. And what did the 7 emergency managers stationed on the island of Maui do the morning of the 7th? They got on a plane and went to Honolulu for a meeting. Wow. There are a lot of areas of the United States where emergency management is not what it should be. In a lot of areas, it's excellent. It's clearly better than it was a quarter of a century ago. But there's still many areas where emergency management is sometimes, those positions are filled with as political favors. They're filled with people who don't really have an interest in emergency management. It's considered to be a cushy job. And as far as I'm concerned, emergency management, as population grows, it's going to become more and more important. Let me give you another idea. In my city of Wichita, a very powerful a very powerful tornado went through agricultural area northwest of the city back in 1973. That same tornado repeats today. It is a densely populated area, and I mean densely populated area with upscale homes, an IMAX theater, gourmet restaurants. We're creating larger and larger geographic targets for disaster. The
Right.
more concrete we pour, the more things we build, inevitably disasters are going to worsen. Well, how do we mitigate that? How do we build in a more intelligent way in those circumstances? Right now, there's no single place to get answers to that. Whereas if you want to know about, let's say, aviation accidents related to icing, you do a search of the NTSB files, and all the information you need is right there. We don't have anything like that. Other nations like Great Britain do, and we need to have it.
Yeah, and you're joined by some people I respect deeply. Bill Hook, who's been he's at the American Meteorological Society. After Katrina, he and a colleague had pushed for this idea. They use a slightly different name, and again, this gets to me to the question of how do we push this over the starting line, not the finish line. It's not just Bill and not just you. There are people at the Natural Resources Defense Council,
Yes.
Amy Weber. As I said,
Yes.
there's legislation. Here is more on this. All right, Representative Katie Porter.
Yes.
This is the bill, National Disaster Safety Board Act of 2021.
Yes, and there's a Senate version, bipartisan.
Yeah, I know. So what's missing?
What is missing, I think, is urgency. Perhaps the Maui fire was too far away from the U.S. mainland for people to absorb everything that went wrong that day, even though similar things had gone wrong a year and a half before in Boulder with a wildfire in that area. Perhaps this disaster that went from the Florida Panhandle to Ohio, that map of power outages from yesterday morning is just stunning. There's still 2.5 million homes without power. That equates to about 8 million people from Florida to Ohio. Maybe this will be what it needs to be. The bill that Representative Porter and others introduced calls for the National Disaster Review Board to be located at a federal laboratory. I think that's a bad idea, or at a university campus. I'd like to see it located on the innovation campus of Wichita State University in what I want to call the Bill Hook building, because Bill has been well ahead of the curve on many important meteorological items throughout his career, and I'd love to see him get that recognition.
Oh, well, I would vote for that. And it's in the heartland too. Which, as you say, with maybe the politics can change, even with climate stuff. I wrote a piece for the New York Times, I think back probably almost 20 years ago, musing on the idea that we're in a country that doesn't have one climate. There's no common discussion to have about it, because in California you got either mega drought or atmospheric river, depending on the month of the year, and in the South, we have the annual hurricane season, and then the upper Midwest doesn't think about any of that stuff. But then you have Amazon warehouses exploding in tornadoes, and so it's hard to get that. I think maybe, as you say, the common experience of a disaster isn't there yet, but we should be more grown up about it. I really feel that it's a good time to think about this once we get through this crazy political moment. Sorry.
I was asked by some people why I haven't been on my blog screaming about the National Disaster Review Board. Well, first of all, it's too soon. I think there's something unseemly about politicizing or using a major disaster as political fodder to get something done. But in another couple of weeks, when things have settled down a little bit, even with the election, when I know they're all focused on getting reelected, perhaps this is an issue that they can take to their constituents and say, I'm in favor of this. We need to do this. We need to cut the loss of life. And most of all, we shouldn't have people utterly cut off from the world because of the remains of a hurricane moving through the area. And so maybe we can use this campaign season, at least its last few weeks, to get something going on this. It's desperately needed.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're on the case. Maybe we'll get Bill on a conversation here with you and some of the other folks, even maybe a couple of politicians who seem to take this seriously. And then I just finally, hearts go out for all those who were affected so terribly by this. One aspect of what a disaster review board, though, would be doing is looking for the successes too.
Yes, absolutely.
I have to go back through my tweets, but earlier this morning, there was an interview. Maybe it was a Washington Post story that they interviewed a couple who had evacuated to Asheville from a town on a river 2 days ahead of time.
Oh, okay.
And I was like, so how did that happen? What was it, a radio broadcast, or was this person a climatologist? Why were there successful evacuations, not just the failures? And I think that's part of what people sometimes miss. They think this is all about finger pointing or the like.
Yes. Well, we need best practices desperately. And there are situations where people use their ingenuity and do wonderful things. We should highlight those. We should pat those people on the back and hold them out as examples for future behavior and future disasters.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on this webcast. I'm going to post it right away, and good luck with this mission you're on. And there's lots more to talk about, particular examples from tornadoes, etc. But and best wishes to all the first responders as well as the
Absolutely.
the
Those
rest of
people are risking their lives for others, and that's the highest calling human nature has.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
My pleasure, Andy. Thank you.
That's Mike Smith, and I highly recommend you follow him on X if you're there, U.S. weather expert, or you just Google for Mike. It's Mike Smith enterpriseblog.com
Yes.
is the website right there. So thanks again.